Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. It's been more than a year since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thousands have been killed and millions are suffering. The world is witnessing the catastrophe and devastation of the war, but the Ukrainian fighting spirit is prevailing against the challenges, and that is what we want to talk about in the show today. From Lviv in Ukraine, we welcome Melaniya Podolyak, who can tell us what's happening on the ground. And in Taipei, we connect to Olek Shyn to discuss aid and humanitarian efforts and the response here in Taiwan. Welcome, both of you. It's great to have you on this program to talk about a very important issue and situation. I'm going to start with you, Melaniya. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about what you're doing.
Thank you, Divya. Yes, so before the war, I used to be an activist, and mostly my line of work was connected to judicial reform, police reform. I used to work in all sorts of government institutions, but obviously on the 24th of February, all of that has come to the standstill virtually. And ever since then, I've been working with different kinds of military and humanitarian efforts, namely for now, I'm a part of TaiwanPlus Charity Foundation. It's the second largest Ukrainian charity foundation that's related to war. Since the beginning of the war, we have raised more than 4 billion hryvnias, and we're currently doing everything we can to supply both our military and our humanitarian causes on the deoccupied territories. And yeah, that has been virtually my entire life since the beginning of this war. Sadly, this was not something I was trained for or ever thought I would be doing. But nevertheless, being here and being able to help is, I think, one of the few things that, keeps us, sane and sound kind of here.
And for you, Olek, I know it also must be difficult watching from afar. Can you tell us what you're doing here and what it's like to be a Ukrainian in Taiwan right now?
Just like in Melaniya's case, I think the full-scale invasion kind of made it the before and the after in life. I used to do education policy research before this all started, but now Ukraine is the main focus, and most of my activities are dedicated to supporting Ukraine. I'm a part of the Taiwanese movement in support of Ukraine called Taiwan Stands with Ukraine. What we do is we organize events, various, like cultural events, protests, information campaigns, and we fundraise a lot, as much as possible, for various needs within Ukraine. And also through the means of digital diplomacy, we try to communicate about Ukraine via an initiative called Ukrainian Voices, 乌克兰之声, where we talk to Taiwanese people and tell them why the war is unjust, unfair, and why Ukrainian people need support from around the world, especially from Taiwan.
I do want to talk more about support both international and within Ukraine. But before we go to that, Melaniya, if you could paint a picture of what it's like to live in Ukraine right now. And I know it's very disparate, with some areas coming under fire or being in the middle of fighting, with other areas relatively shielded and where daily life goes on as normal. Tell us how you make sense of those two.
No, it's actually, you could divide the country basically into these three areas, one of them being the relatively safe one, but so it means the shelling and drone strikes happen every 1 or 2 weeks, basically. So this is and then because...
And that's relatively safe? Is that considered relatively safe?
Yes, that is so. The entirety of Western Ukraine, where I am, the time of the arrival of the rocket, of the missile strike, is lengthy enough so the air defense can, intercept it. So yeah, those are considered to be relatively safe. And then the center and northern parts of Ukraine that are near Belarus, those are considered, you could say, like, relatively unsafe, meaning that because of the proximity to the Belarusian border and the very active Belarusian and Russian aviation, there are more concerns to be had in those areas. Yes, missile strikes still occur as often as, for instance, in the west of Ukraine. However, yes, because also of the lengthy time of strikes, those rockets can usually be intercepted, and drones as well. And then when we speak about actual very dangerous situations, those are usually the east and south of Ukraine, where where the territories are within the reach of Russian artillery. And these cities are struck constantly, nonstop. So the entirety of the day, at least once an hour, you can hear a rocket strike. And also these cities, because of such close proximity to the front line, they're within the reach of Russian artillery. So these are the places where, civilians still live their lives. They live there. Businesses still run. They feed soldiers who live there. You can actually get a decent cup of coffee in these cities. But nevertheless, it is extremely dangerous to live there, and civilian population is encouraged to evacuate and to leave. Obviously, not all of them listen to these recommendations. But nevertheless, yes, those are the territories where where the government would prefer you not to stay.
Mm-hmm. When you listen to that, Oleg, and you hear about these places of your home country where when you left was quite normalized, and now you're hearing what Melaniya says about the situation there, how are you feeling about it?
I mean, heartbroken, of course. It's hard to understand fully what it is like to just be there, even in the relatively safest parts of Ukraine, from the safety of Taiwan. Yeah, I don't think I would ever be able to understand, because I was in Taiwan several months before the invasion started, the full-scale invasion started. But my family was in Ukraine at that time. I'm from Kherson, which is in southern part of the country, and from the southern part of that province. So it was occupied on day one. Unfortunately, Ukraine heavily lost the defenses there at that time, and that was perhaps the worst time in terms of emotions, in terms of stress, any sorts of depression at the time for me personally, because my family was under occupation for several months at least. But then, of course, they left. They did it via Russian territory, but they managed to do that. I think most of us are still in this mode when we, as Melaniya mentioned before, we stop and we say, how do I know these things? How do I know how to, distinguish a missile being launched from missile falling down? These things that no normal person has to know. This is a new reality we live with. So emotionally, I think there's a certain level of resistance and, even sometimes calmness, despite this horrible news and the numbers that you read and the pictures and videos that you see. That's the new norm, unfortunately, for many Ukrainians.
Oleg, our next piece will resonate with you in particular, being from your home city, Kherson. We spoke to Karima Romaniev. She's a 25-year-old Ukrainian Chinese translator, and she was at ground zero of the invasion, which, as we mentioned, was Kherson, and she documented her experiences in a diary, which is going to be published in Taiwan. Take a listen.
At 4 a.m. on February 24th, I woke up to the sound of an explosion at a military base and trembling walls, not only in my city, but all over Ukraine. The first thought that came to every Ukrainian's mind was, the war has begun. I ran to the balcony to see evidence of the explosion to make sure it wasn't a terrible dream. There was nothing in the sky, no panicked people on the streets, no siren, no phone notification about the war beginning. People like me, who were 100% sure there would be no war, couldn't believe what was happening. God knows where those sounds came from. Maybe it was a military training and not a war. But after 5 hours, we found out what had really happened. The city had been occupied by Russians, and we needed to leave.
When the first bombs dropped, Karima was staying with her mother in Kherson, the first Ukrainian city to fall to Russian forces. Kherson is close to Crimea, the territory illegally annexed by Moscow in 2014. Hours after the invasion began, Karima found a taxi for her family to get them out.
We were leaving. At that moment, a military plane flew over my head and it was shut down, just crashed. I was shocked. I got into a taxi, to go to took my little brothers and sisters. And the taxi driver told me terrible stories about how the battle was raging outside the city and dozens of tanks were heading towards the city. I began filming them, mistakenly thought that they were our tanks coming to protect us. When I looked at the videos later and saw the Z sign on them, I realized I had been mistaken.
This was just the beginning of Karima and her family's desperate journey to escape the war. But to reach safety, they would be forced to travel through enemy territory.
Driving towards Ukraine was a road of death, and the Russians were shooting everyone on the road in the car. We were hostages. The only way out was to go to Crimea and then either travel through Russia to Europe or to Georgia. But there were many questions, such as whether I would be allowed to leave Russia with a Ukrainian passport, and how to leave Russia if they cancelled all flights abroad.
A month later, Karima finally made it to Poland. But her ordeal didn't end there. As a refugee, she struggled every day to find a safe place to spend the night.
The 2 weeks in Poland were very difficult. Only the first 3 days we stayed in a hotel, then we changed our place of residence every day. Several million Ukrainians came to Poland, so all hotels, apartments and hostels were overcrowded. Our day went like this. We woke up in the morning, had breakfast, checked out at 12 o'clock, walked with our suitcase to the nearest cafe and searched for a place to stay for the night. We did this every day. After 2 weeks, I was tired of living on a suitcase, like a homeless person.
Last September, Karima decided to go back to her hometown, Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. She returned not just because she's used to the war now, but more importantly, because she says nothing can replace her home there. This is her message to the rest of the world.
War is not what we read in the books or playing computer games. Once it starts, it's hard to stop it. But when there is a risk of it starting, everything must be done to prevent it. I sincerely wish that no one on earth would ever know that war is again. The war is still going on now, and a large number of people are dying every day. Who would have thought that the war would be more than a year? And even more than that. And every day I still pray for peace all over the world.
That's Karima Romani reading from her diary, which is soon to be published here in Taiwan in traditional Chinese. Do check out our YouTube channel for the full version of this feature. Let me go back to our guests now. Melaniya, so many things to think about from that piece, but I just want to ask you first, why did you decide to stay in Ukraine despite all the dangers you're facing?
We really believe, and it was the right thing to do, really believe in our armed forces. Our president has proved to, be capable of handling the situation. So after the first couple of days when Kyiv did not fall, when we kind of understood that there is a fighting chance and that we can actually do something, the decision was made to stay here and join forces with other people that I was friends with at the time, and to kind of put all our effort that we can into helping our military. War has been raging in Ukraine since 2014, obviously not on this scale. You can't even compare. But the thing is that, it's our land, and leaving it. I feel for the people who had to leave the occupied territories, and I hope they will come back someday. But leaving your land and leaving everything behind is extremely difficult. So when there is a fighting chance and when there is a hope, that victory can still be achieved, it's very difficult to make a decision to leave. So yeah, that's why I didn't do it.
Right, and speaking of leaving lands or having to be displaced, Olek, you have a very interesting family history. You're ethnically Korean. Your family's been displaced many, many times. Can you give us a bit of background about that and tell us how they're viewing Ukraine right now especially as they thought it would probably be a place of peace where they could bring up their children?
Yeah, so I'm a fourth generation Korean Ukrainian, and my great-grandparents were victims to the 1937 Korean deportation by Stalin, which was part of very popular at the time a Soviet move, which was to move people around as much as possible around the empire, the Soviet empire, and then replace their homes with, well, ethnically Russians or so. And that happened also to 172,000 Korean people who lived in the Far East. Then we ended up in Central Asia. And so I grew up in Central Asia, but then we moved to Ukraine when I was very small. And I grew up in independent Ukraine, but I would say we still kind of carried the legacy of the burden and the trauma of those events and of Russian colonialism in general, especially growing up in Ukraine and realizing that we as descendants of the victims live among people here who are also survivors of Russian historical abuse. This is something that really helped me understand my own history, because at home we would talk about the Korean deportation and whatever Russians did to Ukrainians back then, how we lost our language. And then I would go to a Ukrainian school and talk to teachers and other kids, and we would listen about the stories of Holodomor, the famine genocide of 1932-33, and those events, or the Crimean Tatar deportation. In that regard, I think it would really be helpful for people around the world to understand why Ukraine is fighting. It's not a new thing. It didn't start a year ago or even in 2014. It's intergenerational. It's been going on for generations, and unfortunately, this perpetrator, the Russian Empire, was never punished.
And going back to that, Melaniya, can you tell us how much of a fight this is, not only about preserving your country, but the Ukrainian identity itself?
I mean, I could not agree more with what he has just said. Myself, I am a descendant of my grandma. Was living in central Ukraine in 32-33, and all of her brothers and sisters died during the famine. My grandparents were then deported to the northern Russia because they had land in the 40s. So it's a complete and absolutely correct assessment that this is the battle not for just the independence that we have garnered in the 90s, but also it's a battle for our identity and for our existence virtually, because this is what is living like near the imperialist kind of force which Russia is. So it is absolutely correct to assess that, this fight has been going on for hundreds of years now. And this is not just a matter of losing land, really. It's not about, like the Crimea is occupied, Donbass is occupied, whatnot. It's a matter of, Ukrainians existing as a nation and Ukraine existing as a sovereign country.
And Olek, if we bring it back to here in Taiwan, can you tell us about some of the conversations you're having with people here in Taiwan as you're raising the Ukraine cause, and also about the greater discussion that is happening where Taiwan could very much be in the position Ukraine is in now?
Which I hope will never happen, of course. But I think after the full-scale invasion started, here in Taiwan, we started having a lot of conversations and explore a lot of context of solidarity and similarities. And it's not all the same, of course, but there are a lot of themes that Taiwanese people, I think, can understand about Ukraine because of the similarity in our histories. Either it is colonization or linguistic cultural assimilation, or, as Melaniya mentioned, reclaiming your identity, your voice, being able to present yourself in your own way, in your own words, not through, the neighbor's propaganda machine and so on. There's a lot of solidarity that we experience as Ukrainians living in Taiwan.
Right, and speaking of solidarity, there's international solidarity comes in many forms. We've seen lots of countries around the world reach out to Ukraine, in Taiwan especially, as we mentioned. It really does resonate, but it also especially has resonated in Ukraine's neighboring country of Poland. Now, many people have extended a helping hand there. Rafał Tamala's charity network has been reaching out to the distressed and helpless Ukrainians in Poland and providing food, shelter, and other essentials for thousands of refugees from across the border. Our reporter Leslie Liao traveled to Poland to learn more about the charity and Taiwan's active participation in their work.
Now we are trying to go to Kiev.
Rafał Tamala checks in on one of his charity's drivers who's transporting supplies through Ukraine. He is the head of Fundacja Rozwoju Regionów based in Warsaw. It's a foundation that shelters Ukrainian refugees and provides them with everything from food to legal assistance. The foundation had humble beginnings, but in just 1 year of operation, it has grown considerably.
And suddenly somebody called me and told me, Rafał, we have on the railway station 9 children from Ukraine. It's worth start. Do you have the place in your hostel? And we said yes. And now we have 4,500 children in the camps, in the orphans' houses, at school.
Such a vast network requires reliable supply lines. Tamala, an engineer by trade, established a logistical network linking Ukraine and other countries, with his warehouse in Warsaw acting as a central hub. Tamala organized volunteer drivers, and it became so efficient that people send donations into Ukraine through the organization.
People from Taiwan bought it for us. They pay for some of the sleeping bags.
Tamala often stresses that his organization's success is a joint effort.
I'm not alone, I have very often, we have a lot of the people, Yes. Probably you know somebody, your colleagues in the factory, or maybe it's the regisseur of the film or somebody, and people, they're working in the night to help us.
Tamala's enthusiasm and energy is infectious. People can't help but feel drawn to him. And during a time of rampant division and chaos, his organization is uniting countries, people, and goods. The goal is to help bring some semblance of peace to those whose lives have been disrupted by the Ukraine war.
From Taiwan with love.
Leon Lien and Leslie Liao in Warsaw, Poland for TaiwanPlus.
Melaniya, before we talk about the bigger international efforts in humanitarian aid to Ukraine, can we talk about what's happening on the ground there and how people are managing day to day with, for instance, I heard that, people are setting up charging stations, simple things like that, so that the disruption isn't too large, or to try and smooth out some of those disruptions?
The entire daily life has virtually been situated around the war and war efforts and, whatever war brings. So yes, we have all sorts of different places you can go when there are the blackouts, because Russians usually strike our energy grid. So where you can charge your phone, where you can have a drink and have some food, and just, during the winter we had issues with heating because of that, so you can get warm there. And then people collect things for the military nonstop all the time. So that includes both things like provisions, food, aid, but also vehicles, cars, drones, civilian drones and whatnot. So the daily lives have been, 90% of what people in Ukraine do has something to do with war or around, whatever war brings.
Right. And Oleg, you've been working very closely with Taiwanese here, or, speaking to a lot of, as we said, Taiwanese groups about what Ukraine needs or how to help them. What is the kind of response you're getting, and what is it that you feel that you can do the most in aid of your home country?
Well, supporting the army is the most important thing, of course. What Melaniya does and her foundation, that is the most important thing. Everything is important, of course, the humanitarian sphere and healthcare and so on. But if our army fails, then we just lose our country. That's a simple answer. It has, however, been difficult to convince people to support the Ukrainian army, because for some reason people outside of Ukraine do not necessarily feel convinced that it's okay to support an armed cause, although for us as Ukrainians it's quite obvious why we should be doing that. Most of the activities we've been doing was, of course, to collect funds for humanitarian aid and something related to that. So just a week ago, we co-sponsored an ambulance truck. We bought it in Germany with our partners, and it's on its way to Ukraine already. And we're organizing a couple of more events. It's mostly about fundraising. Another important thing is, of course, celebrating Ukrainian culture and manifesting Ukrainian culture and language in all spaces, Ukrainian narratives as well. That is especially in light of what Russia is doing, trying to destroy Ukraine, not only physically, but also to destroy Ukraine's identity, the whole understanding of what it is to realize yourself as a Ukrainian. So we think the tool against that is to celebrate Ukraine as much as possible.
That's all the time we have here for this show today, and this is where we say goodbye to our viewers, but Melaniya and Olek will be staying with us to continue this very important conversation, which will feature in our next episode of Connected. Thank you for your company, and until next time, stay connected.